Long ago, humanity danced among the stars. Their ships cut through the darkness of space like knives. Their colonies blossomed on thousands of worlds. They were known, feared, and respected throughout the galaxy. But then came the fall. Not a war or disease, but something worse. A slow, creeping decay. Humans turned against each other, fighting over scraps, forgetting the stars they once ruled. One by one, their colonies went silent. Earth, their home world, became a myth whispered. Among the stars, a dead rock abandoned by the children who had once loved it. The galaxy moved on without them. Empires rose and fell. Treaties were signed. Wars were waged. Humanity became a footnote in history, a memory no one bothered to fear anymore. The Solarians, a sleek reptilian race, ruled the central systems now. They saw themselves as the natural, leaders of the galaxy. And why not? There was no one left to challenge them. The Morvac, massive beasts wrapped in metallic armor, controlled the outer rim, and they too had forgotten the pale-skinned, fragile creatures who once dared to defy them. In the minds of the powerful, humans were a ghost story, a race too weak to survive, too disorganized to matter. But they were wrong. It started with whispers. A cargo ship gone missing along trade routes. A secret meeting of planetary governors ending with every delegate dead and no sign of the assassin. Entire pirate fleets wiped out without a single distress call. At first, the galaxy's rulers blamed each other. They thought the Morvac were flexing their muscles. Maybe the Solarians were cleaning up the outer sectors. No one wanted to believe the truth. No one dared. On a backwater moon named Chorus 7, an old mining colony barely worth noticing, something different was happening. The miners, mostly a mix of smaller species long oppressed by the big empires, were being armed, trained, organized. At the center of it all was a man. He wore battered armor scavenged from a dozen worlds. His hair was dusted with gray, his face lined and hard, but his eyes burned with a deep, wild fire no other race could quite understand. His name was Commander Elias Vance, and he was human. When the first Solarian patrol came to Chorus to remind the miners of their place, they didn't. Even bring heavy weapons, they expected compliance. A few threats, a few public executions, and the problem would go away. They never even had time to scream. Commander Elias Vance and his handful of rebels ambushed them at the spaceport, dismantling the patrol with brutal precision. Not flashy, not glorious, efficient, quick, human. The news spread fast. First through the mining worlds, then the mid-tier colonies. Whispers of a human uprising, a real one. Not the scattered pockets of stubbornness that had always fizzled out. This was something organized. This was something dangerous. The Solarians laughed it off. A few soldiers missing on some dirt ball planet? Hardly a threat. The Morvac ignored it entirely. Humans were dead, weren't they? The Council of Dominance didn't even bother to meet over it. But Commander Elias Vance wasn't interested in recognition. He wasn't fighting for headlines. He had a plan, and it was simple. Wake the galaxy up, remind them who humanity was, and make them wish they had kept fearing humans all along. The next target was bigger, riskier. The weapons depot on Nexus Reach wasn't just a storage facility, it was a symbol. It supplied half the Solarian fleet across the sector. Hitting it wasn't just sabotage, it was war. Commander Elias Vance stood at the edge of the rocky outcrop, overlooking the depot, the cold wind whipping his tattered cloak around his shoulders. Beside him crouched Lyra, a former miner from Chorus 7 with nerves of steel and a hatred for Solarians that burned brighter than the twin suns above them. "You sure about this?" she asked, adjusting the crude rifle in her hands. Elias didn't answer right away. His gaze was locked on the glittering towers below, the neat rows of weaponized vehicles, the rhythmic patrols of Solarian soldiers confident in their untouchable supremacy. "We don't have the luxury of being sure," he said finally. We either strike now or we die forgotten. Lyra grinned fiercely. Then let's make sure they remember us. The plan was simple because it had to be. They didn't have tanks. They didn't have warships. They had explosives cobbled together from mining charges, outdated rifles, and desperation. But desperation had a funny way of sharpening a blade. As the twin moons rose, Commander Elias Vance and his small crew descended into the valley, moving like ghosts. They slipped through shadows, disabling cameras, taking out sentries with silent knives and quick, brutal moves. No flashy gunfire, no alarms, just the quiet, growing sense of dread creeping over the depot as the first fires broke out. When the explosives went off, it wasn't a single neat explosion. It was chaos. Towers crumbled. Ammunition stores ignited in great roaring balls of fire. The ground shook as entire stockpiles of weapons vaporized in a single glorious instant. The few surviving Solarians tried to mount a defense, but they were disoriented, panicked. They weren't used to being attacked. They weren't used to fear. Elias watched from the ridge as the depot collapsed in flames, the fire reflecting in his hard, unblinking eyes. "Message sent," Lyra said beside him, panting from the sprint back up the hill. He nodded once. Not the message, the warning. They didn't stay to celebrate. Victory wasn't the goal, survival was, and as they melted back into the wastelands carrying what stolen supplies they could, Commander Elias Vance knew that tonight wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, systems once loyal to the Solarians began to question. Why had the depot fallen? Who had the power, the audacity to strike so deep? Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into fear. And the one word carried by every frightened merchant, every spooked governor, every trembling informant was the same. Humans. For the first time in centuries, that word didn't bring laughter. It brought silence. The Solarian High Council convened in secret, their sleek forms gathered around a grand obsidian table. They spoke in hurried, angry tones, too proud to admit what clawed at their minds. Commander Zentex, the enforcer of the mid-rim, slammed his clawed fist onto the table, cracking the stone. "They're vermin," he snarled. "Scattered rats. I will personally crush this rebellion before it takes root." The Supreme Speaker narrowed his amber eyes. "You would do well not to underestimate rats, Zentex. They have a way of gnawing through the strongest walls." For the first time in centuries, the mighty races of the galaxy felt a whisper of something they thought long dead. Not fear, not yet. Unease. And that was exactly what Commander Elias Vance wanted, because unease was the crack in the dam, and soon the flood would come. Commander Elias Vance didn't waste time. The galaxy was waking up, but not fast enough. Fear had to spread like fire, outpacing reason before the powers could stamp it out. That meant more attacks, bigger, bolder, louder. Their next move was pure madness, hijacking a Morvac dreadnought. The Morvac were monsters in both size and reputation, standing 3 meters tall with fists like wrecking balls and skin like living. Steel, they ruled the outer rims with brute force. Their dreadnoughts were more than ships. They were moving fortresses, each one capable of leveling planets. Stealing one? Insanity, which is why it was perfect. The Morvac wouldn't see it coming. No one would. The plan began on Tyros, a forgotten refueling station orbiting a dead star. The Morvac's dreadnought Iron Fist docked there for repairs. Its crew relaxed, arrogant, assuming no one would dare approach them. Commander Elias Vance and his crew blended with the dock workers, wearing stolen uniforms and carrying falsified codes. They moved with the easy gait of the invisible, the people. No one noticed. The ones who served but never mattered until they struck. It started with the engineering decks. Small bombs rigged to critical systems. Sabotage masked as mechanical failures. By the time the alarms started blaring, Elias and his strike team were already deep inside the ship. The corridors were chaos. Morvac roaring orders, systems flashing, warnings, emergency lights pulsing blood red, exactly as planned. Elias led his team straight to the bridge, cutting through surprised Morvac soldiers with brutal close-quarters precision. No firefights, no drawn-out battles. Humans had learned you didn't beat strength with strength. You beat it with speed, with ruthlessness, with a willingness to do what the enemy thought impossible. Lyra took a plasma bolt to the shoulder, but kept moving, her teeth gritted in grim defiance. Rook, their wiry tech expert, hacked into the ship's systems on the fly, rerouting controls, locking down blast doors, turning the dreadnought's own defenses against itself. When they reached the command throne, Elias didn't hesitate. The Morvac captain, a massive brute named Gorak, stood to meet him, snarling in disbelief. "Human!" Gorak spat the word like it was filth. Elias leveled his weapon calmly. "Surprised? You are ants!" Gorak roared, charging. Elias sidestepped, dodging the first swing that shattered a metal console. He fired point blank, not at Gorak's armored chest, but at his eyes. The plasma bolt seared through the Morvac's skull, dropping the beast mid-charge. Silence fell over the bridge. Elias holstered his weapon, turning slowly to face the terrified Morvac crew still alive. "This ship belongs to humanity now," he said, his voice cold, measured. "Spread the word." He let them flee. He wanted them to. Within hours, the Iron Fist lit up the comms across the sector, its stolen codes overriding every broadcast system. Commander Elias Vance's face appeared, grim, bloodied, alive. "We are the forgotten," he said. "We are the ghosts you laughed at, the ashes you thought scattered. You thought humanity was weak. You thought we were finished. You were wrong. Across 1,000 worlds, across every system and sector, beings of every race stopped what they were doing and listened. And for the first time in living memory, they heard a human voice declaring war. Elias's final words echoed through the stars. We remember everything you did to us, and we are coming. Panic rippled through the galaxy. Trade routes were locked down. Armies were scrambled. The Solarians and Morvac held emergency councils, blaming each other, pointing fingers. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They didn't dare speak aloud. Humanity was back, and this time they weren't playing by the old rules. The Iron Fist became more than just a stolen ship. It became a symbol, a moving nightmare for the old powers. Every time the dreadnought appeared on sensors, entire fleets scrambled and planets locked down, terrified of what would come next. But Commander Elias Vance wasn't reckless. He didn't turn the dreadnought into a blunt instrument like the Morvac had. He used it with precision, like a scalpel, striking where it would hurt the most: supply depots, communication arrays, propaganda centers. Every attack was sharp, fast, and devastating, leaving systems in chaos and governments scrambling. In the shattered edges of the mid-rim territories, a legend began to grow. They called him the Revenant, the human who came back from the dead. Meanwhile, the Solarians and the Morvac did what they always did when scared. They lashed out blindly. They doubled taxes on the minor species, arrested entire villages suspected of human collaboration, executed workers at the slightest hint of rebellion. In doing so, they made the fires of anger burn even hotter. Commander Elias Vance understood. Something the empires had forgotten. Terror doesn't control people forever. Not when they have nothing left to lose. Inside the bridge of the Iron Fist, the atmosphere was tense but electric. Lyra sat with her arms still in a sling, glaring at a holographic map displaying the next targets. Rook was bent over a console, muttering to himself as he reprogrammed the dreadnought's stolen navigation systems. Elias stood at the helm, his arms crossed, surveying it all. "We're gaining momentum," Rook said without looking up. Got a dozen colonies sending encrypted messages. They want to join us. Some are even offering fleets, small ones, but still. And the downside? Elias asked, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. Rook hesitated. The Morvac are angry. Really angry. Word is, they've sent the Death Fangs after us. The room went silent. Even Lyra's confident smirk faded. The Death Fangs weren't just another Morvac fleet. They were specialists, brutal, unrelenting hunters, trained to eradicate threats without mercy or hesitation. They didn't capture. They didn't negotiate. They exterminated. Elias's jaw tightened, but he gave a short nod. Good. Let them come. Lyra gave a short bark of laughter. You're insane, old man. Probably, Elias said, allowing a rare, thin smile. But that's what they're afraid of. We'll make it worse. He tapped the screen, marking a new target, the old prison moon of Hades Prime. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't wealthy. It was forgotten. A dumping ground for political dissidents, rebels, and undesirables from a dozen conquered species. If they freed the prisoners there, it wouldn't just be a military win. It would be a spark, a raging, unstoppable wildfire. 3. Days later, the Iron Fist dropped out of warp above Hades Prime, engines growling low like a beast itching for a fight. The prison's defense systems, ancient and barely functional, tried to activate, but Rook disabled them with a few contemptuous keystrokes. Elias led the charge himself. They landed hard, boots kicking up the red dust of the prison yards. Alarms blared weakly from broken speakers as Elias, Lyra, and a small strike team cut through the guards with brutal clinical precision. The prisoners, gaunt, beaten, nearly broken, stared at them in disbelief. A tall, skeletal being with translucent skin stepped forward, eyes wide. You're human, it said, its voice trembling with something between fear and hope. Elias nodded once. You want to fight? A low murmur rose from the prisoners. First uncertainty, then anger, then a roar. Weapons were thrown into desperate hands, chains were broken, walls were torn down. By the time they left Hades Prime, the prison was a smoking ruin, and 1,000 new soldiers followed them into the void, human and alien alike. Elias stood at the airlock, watching as the planet shrank away behind them. Lyra came to stand beside him, her face serious for once. This is bigger than us, now, she said. It was always bigger than us, Elias replied quietly. We're just the spark. Far off in the distance, sensors flashed. The Death Fangs had arrived, massive ships, hulking silhouettes against the stars, bristling with weapons meant to annihilate. Elias turned to his crew, a fire in his chest that felt almost like joy. Get ready, he said, because now it wasn't just humanity's fight. It was everyone's. And the galaxy was about to find out what happened when you pushed the forgotten too far. The Death Fangs didn't waste time. The moment they dropped into orbit around Hades Prime, they opened fire, hammering the surface with kinetic missiles and plasma bombardments. Dust and fire roared into the sky, blackening the stars above. The Iron Fist shook violently under the first barrage as Elias and his crew scrambled across the bridge. Shields down to 60%, Rook shouted over the alarms. They're trying to pin us against the moon, Lyra snarled, slamming a fresh power cell into her rifle. Turn this ship into a tomb. Commander Elias Vance didn't flinch. His mind raced, cold and sharp. The Death Fangs were bigger, stronger, and more heavily armed. Head on, they didn't stand a chance. Good. They didn't come here to fight fair. Drop us into the debris field, Elias ordered. Rook blinked. You serious? We could tear the hull apart. Better torn apart than blown apart. Do it. Cursing under his breath, Rook wrestled the helm, forcing the Iron Fist into a steep dive, engines howling in protest. The ship plunged into the thick cloud of wreckage. The broken bones of old satellites, dead ships, shattered defense stations. Chunks of metal slammed into the hull, and the ship groaned like a dying animal. But the Death Fangs didn't follow. Not yet. They hesitated, wary of losing their technological advantage inside the deadly junk cloud. "Now," Elias growled, "we hunt." Inside the debris field, the Iron Fist became a ghost. Rook killed the main drives, letting the ship drift silently among the wreckage. They powered down weapons, dimmed lights, became part of the graveyard. Meanwhile, Lyra and a hand-picked boarding team suited up. They didn't plan to fight the Death Fang ship to ship. That would be suicide. They planned to do something much more human. Get inside, bleed them from within. One by one, stealth pods launched from the Iron Fist, barely detectable against the surrounding debris. The Morvac ships, slow and overconfident, didn't even notice until it was too late. Elias himself led the assault. They breached the outer hulls of the Death Fang ships with magnetic charges, slipping into the dark corridors beyond. Inside, it was pure chaos. The Morvac were used to crushing opposition with overwhelming force. They weren't prepared for the brutal, silent fury of a human boarding party. They weren't ready for the quick knives in the dark, the scavenged explosives hidden inside power cores, the precision strikes against vital systems. It wasn't war. It was slaughter. Elias moved like a shadow through the enemy ship, carving a path of destruction. He planted charges on reactor cores, sabotaged life support, tore through command decks before the enemy even knew where to shoot. He made them bleed. When the first Death Fang's cruiser exploded from within, the others panicked. They fired blindly into the debris field, hitting each other as much as the wreckage around them. Their discipline shattered, their formation broke, and the Iron Fist struck. Engines roaring back to life, the stolen dreadnought surged out of the debris field, weapons blazing. Torpedoes slammed into the flanks of the remaining ships, ripping open metal like paper. Plasma cannons sliced through armor, punching holes the size of buildings into the enemy cruisers. What was supposed to be a clean extermination became a massacre, but not the one the Morvac intended. It was over in less than an hour. The death. Fangs, feared across the galaxy, were annihilated. Their wreckage drifted silently through space, burning and broken. On the bridge of the Iron Fist, the crew sat in stunned silence, panting, bleeding, alive. Elias leaned heavily against the railing, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from a shallow cut across his temple, but his eyes blazed. "We did it!" Lyra breathed, looking around in disbelief. We beat them!" Elias pushed himself upright. His voice was raw but steady. This was never about beating them. This was about sending a message. He turned towards the cracked viewport, watching the fires spread across the stars. "Tell the galaxy," he said. "The hunters have become the hunted. Across the fractured colonies, across the enslaved worlds, across every hidden corner where hope had once died, the news spread like wildfire. The Death Fangs were dead, and humanity was alive. Not just alive, rising. The empires, once so certain of their rule, realized something terrible and true. They hadn't just forgotten humanity, they had underestimated them, and that mistake was going to cost them everything. The galaxy didn't know how to react. For centuries, strength had belonged to the Solarians, the Morvac, and the few other dominant species who carved up star systems like property deeds. Fear was a tool they wielded as easily as a blade. But now fear had changed sides. News of the Death Fang's destruction shattered whatever illusion of control the old empires had left. On Narisate, every world, from the rich core planets to the forgotten mining moons, small acts of rebellion exploded overnight. Worker riots, sabotaged garrisons, entire colonies declaring independence, and everywhere, woven through every desperate transmission, one name kept surfacing: humanity. On the political capital of Luminar Prime, the Solarian High Council met under full emergency lockdown. The great halls, once glittering with arrogance and pride, now reeked of panic. Supreme Speaker Vorax slammed a clawed hand onto the central table. "We cannot allow this infection to spread." Across from him, Admiral Kiris, once proud, now visibly aged from the stress, bared his fangs. "Half our fleets are tied up putting down revolts. Our colonies are bleeding resources. If we overcommit, the Morvac will seize our territories." The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just humans anymore. The whole galaxy was teetering, drunk, on the first real taste of freedom in generations. And no one, not the Solarians, not the Morvac, not the bureaucratic worms that ruled from gilded thrones, had the strength to hold it back. Meanwhile, on the Iron Fist, Commander Elias Vance stood before a growing army. Humans, aliens, former slaves, miners, mercenaries, exiled governors, even deserters from the Solarian fleets, anyone with a grudge and a gun. The docking bay was packed, the air buzzing with raw electric anger. Elias didn't give speeches often. He wasn't a politician. He was a reminder, a ghost of humanity's brutal, unstoppable will. He stepped onto a crate, rough and blood-stained, and let his voice carry through the bay. "They forgot about us," he began, his voice low and hard. "They laughed when we fell. They buried us under their laws, their taxes, their boots. They fed on our weakness, thinking it made them strong." He looked out over the crowd, faces bruised, scarred, but burning with the same fire that roared in his own chest. They were wrong. A roar went up, deep and ragged. Elias raised a fist. "We are not here to beg. We are not here to ask. We are here to take back what they stole." Another shout, louder now. He leaned forward, voice sharp as a blade. "Every broken world, every stolen life, every forgotten name." He let the silence stretch, taut and heavy. "They will remember us, and they will fear us." The bay exploded into a deafening roar. Rook grinned from his post at the side, nudging Lyra. "Told you he'd start a war with words alone." Lyra only smiled grimly, checking her rifle. "Words are nice. Bullets are better." Outside the Iron Fist, the fleet grew. It wasn't polished or pretty. A patchwork of stolen freighters, retrofitted mining rigs, ancient corvettes held together by hope and determination. But it was real, and for the first time in living memory, it flew under a human banner. Not the old, polished insignias of the fallen Terran Empire. Something simpler, a tattered black flag. One word painted across it in blood-red letters: "Remember." And across the stars, in the secret rooms where cowards plotted and tyrants schemed, the fear they had once wielded like a weapon began to twist against them. Because it's easy to rule the desperate. It's easy to crush the broken, but when you push the forgotten too far, when you treat memory like dust, you don't just lose power. You get dragged into the fire, and Commander Elias Vance was ready to set the whole galaxy ablaze. The first empire to truly fall wasn't the Morvac. It wasn't even the Solarians. It was the Viper Syndicate, a slimy cartel that had thrived by selling out weaker species to the highest bidder. They ruled a dozen systems, with an iron fist and a network of mercenaries and assassins, or at least they used to. Commander Elias Vance targeted them first for one reason: they had forgotten fear entirely. The syndicate leaders laughed when news of the human fleet spread. They mocked the rebellion on their secure channels, calling them scraps and ghosts. They bragged that their assassins would cut out Elias's heart and serve it on a silver plate. They didn't understand. This wasn't rebellion. It was a reckoning. It started with the siege of Kronos III, the syndicate's pride and joy, a fortress world, heavily fortified, surrounded by defense satellites and orbital mines. Elias didn't order a traditional assault. He didn't have the patience for that kind of slow bleed. Instead, he unleashed terror. The iron fist warped in under a sensor shadow so close to the planet's atmosphere that it rattled from turbulence. Behind it came a fleet of ragged ships, barely spaceworthy, patched with stolen parts, painted with defiant slogans in every language imaginable. They didn't follow standard battle formations. They didn't issue warnings. They didn't negotiate. The fleet descended like wolves onto Kronos 3, blasting through defense grids with ruthless efficiency. Teams of human and alien commandos rained down onto the surface, using retrofitted mining pods to punch through defenses like missiles. The Syndicate's elite guards fought back, of course, but they fought the way privileged men always fought, hiding behind walls, trusting in armor and status. Elias's people fought differently. They fought like those who had nothing left to lose. They fought like monsters. Lyra led the ground assault, her arms still stiff from old wounds, but her aim deadly as ever. She moved through the Syndicate's strongholds with merciless precision, leaving a trail of bodies behind her. Rook, meanwhile, hacked into the planet's communication grid, broadcasting Commander Elias Vance's voice on every frequency. Kronos 3 is falling. Your leaders have abandoned you. Lay down your arms. Join us or be forgotten. It wasn't just a bluff. When the first Syndicate mercenary crews defected, throwing down their weapons, pledging loyalty to the new banner, the tide turned fast. By the third day, the Syndicate's remaining forces barricaded themselves inside their central fortress, a sprawling black citadel carved into the side of a mountain. Elias stood at the foot of the great gates, surrounded by his growing army. He didn't send emissaries. He didn't offer terms. He simply raised his rifle, aimed at the massive iron doors, and fired the first shot. The final battle for Kronos 3 was ugly, brutal, and short. When it was done, the fortress was a smoking ruin. The Syndicate lords, once fat and powerful, were dragged into the open in chains, their jeweled robes stained with blood and ash. Elias stood before them, his face expressionless. You sold your own people for profit. You forgot what fear was. 1. Of the lords, a bloated creature with 7 eyes and a golden tongue tried to bluster, tried to offer riches, bribes, information. Elias shot him between the eyes without a word. The others didn't beg after that. The Viper Syndicate collapsed overnight. Systems once chained by debt and fear rose up, seizing power, throwing off the yoke of slavery. And on every liberated world, the black flag of remember was raised. Not because Elias demanded it, but because the people chose it. Because across the galaxy, the message was clear. If you had suffered, if you had been forgotten, if you had been crushed, there was a place for you under the human banner, but it wasn't all victory. Not all battles were bloodless. As Elias stood in the ruins of the fortress, watching prisoners being loaded onto transports, Lyra approached him quietly. We lost 2 ships in orbit, she said. Good people. Elias didn't flinch. Loss was a given. It soaked into his bones like old scars. They knew the cost, he said. And now the galaxy knows ours. Because the dream wasn't peace. It wasn't even freedom. It was vengeance, raw and burning. And the empires were starting to realize there was no treaty, no deal, no surrender that would save them. Only the ashes would remain. The galaxy was burning. It started in the outer colonies, then the mid-rim worlds. And now it was racing toward the core like wildfire through dry grass. Systems that had never known rebellion were toppling overnight. Armies that once crushed uprisings with a flick of a wrist were losing ground to mobs with stolen rifles and makeshift warships. The name Commander Elias Vance was no longer whispered in fear. It was chanted. It was roared across battlefields and blasted across seized comm towers. On Luminar Prime, the jewel of the Solarian Empire, the streets boiled with revolt. Statues of long-dead tyrants toppled, Grand halls where treaties had been signed in blood now burned with the fires of justice. Commander. Elias Vance didn't lead every fight. He didn't have to anymore. He had become something bigger than a man. He was a symbol of a truth too terrible for the old empires to accept. Humanity had survived. Humanity had remembered. And now humanity was teaching the galaxy what it meant to be feared. On board the Iron Fist, Elias stood alone in the command bay, staring out at the chaos of Luminar Prime's orbit. The Solarian fleet, once the terror of the stars, was shattered. Ships drifted like corpses through space, fires eating their hulls, escape pods scattering like insects. Behind him, Lyra approached, armor scorched, helmet tucked under one arm. "We took the High Council chambers," she reported. "It's done." Elias didn't turn to look at her. "They surrender?" Lyra hesitated. "They begged." A long, cold silence settled between them. Elias nodded once. Good. He had no mercy left to give. Rook appeared next, blood on his uniform, a triumphant grin on his face. "We control the broadcast network. You're live to every system still listening." Elias turned slowly, the weight of 1,000 dead worlds heavy on his shoulders. He stepped toward the comm station, placed his hands on the console, and leaned in close. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and final. "This is Commander Elias Vance of humanity. You forgot us. You erased us from your histories. You called us weak, savage, broken." He paused, letting the words sink into every trembling. "Hard across the stars. You were wrong." Images flashed across every screen in the galaxy. The fall of Kronos 3, the wreckage of the Death Fangs, the black flag of Remember rising over Luminar Prime. "We are not your slaves. We are not your footnotes. We are the storm you thought would never come." He leaned back, staring into the endless dark between the stars. "And we are not done." Across the galaxy, planets surrendered before a shot could be fired. Others fought and were ground into dust. Elias didn't seek out peace talks. He didn't seat himself at diplomatic tables. He left that for others, new leaders rising from the ashes. He had a different task, one last task, the Morvac homeworld. The monstrous race that had enslaved billions, had burned human colonies to ash, had laughed the loudest when Earth fell. Elias would not let them go quietly. The fleet massed around the Iron Fist, a tattered armada stitched from the bones of a dozen fallen empires. Humans, aliens, even former enemies stood side by side, not under a flag of diplomacy, under a flag of vengeance. As they approached, Morvac Prime, the once mighty home world, the skies filled with enemy ships. The Morvac had fortified their world, ready for the final stand. They wanted to make humanity bleed one last time, and Elias was more than willing to oblige. The final battle was cataclysmic. Starships collided, burned, tore each other apart with brutal savagery. Ground assaults ravaged the surface, cities crumbling under the weight of bombs and boots. The Morvac fought like the monsters they were, but they had forgotten one simple truth. Nothing fights harder than the forgotten. Commander Elias Vance led the charge himself, boots pounding the ruined streets of their capital, rifle flashing fire, and death. When the last Morvac warlord fell, choking on his own blood, Elias stood atop the shattered remains of the enemy palace. The black flag was raised behind him, torn and scorched but unbroken. The galaxy watched in silence. They would not forget humanity again because humanity would not allow it. Standing atop the fallen palace of the Morvac warlords, Commander Elias Vance let the weight of victory settle upon his shoulders. Not with joy, but with grim satisfaction. The black flag of Remember snapped in the acrid wind behind him, tattered, yet defiant. Blood ran in rivulets down the palace steps, mingling Morvac and human alike. In death, at least, they were equals. "It's over," Lyra said, climbing the rubble to stand beside him. Her face was streaked with soot and blood, one eye swollen shut. "We won." Elias didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept across the burning cityscape, the columns of smoke rising like dark fingers against the alien sky. Victory. Such a simple word for such a complex reality. "No," he said finally. "It's just beginning." Because conquest was easy compared to what came next. Anyone could tear down. The true test would be building something from the ashes that wouldn't become the very thing they had fought to destroy. In the days that followed, as their forces secured the Morvac territories, Elias withdrew. He spent hours alone in his quarters aboard the Iron Fist, poring over ancient texts and historical records, searching for answers in humanity's forgotten past. Rook found him there one evening, surrounded by holographic displays and tattered paper books, relics salvaged from dead colonies. "The others are asking for you," Rook said, leaning against the doorframe. "They want to know what happens now." Elias looked up, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "They're asking the wrong person." "You're our leader." "I'm a weapon," Elias said flatly. "And the war is over." Rook stepped forward, concern etched on his face. "Then what are we? What's left when the fighting stops?" It was the question that haunted Elias. What was humanity without its anger, without its need for vengeance? What identity remained when the flames of hatred finally burned out? 3 weeks after the fall of Morvac Prime, delegates from across the galaxy gathered on neutral ground, the ancient trading post of Nexus Station. Once a hub of commerce, now a symbolic meeting point between old powers and new forces. Representatives from every surviving race attended, the remaining Solarian lords, diminished but still proud, the few Morvac chieftains who had surrendered, early enough to keep their lives, representatives from a dozen lesser species now tasting freedom for the first time, and humanity. Commander Elias Vance entered the Great Hall last, flanked by Lyra and a small honor guard. He wore simple attire, not the battle-scarred armor they expected, but plain civilian clothes. The only mark of his identity was a small black patch on his shoulder. "Remember." The hall fell silent as he approached the central table. All eyes followed him, some in awe, others in terror, many in hatred barely contained. An elderly Solarian stepped forward, her scales dull with age. "Commander Vance," she said, her voice crackling, "the galaxy awaits your terms." The words hung in the air. This was what they all expected. Harsh demands, crushing reparations, the brutal reorganization of power that always followed war. They expected the cycle to continue as it always had. Instead, Elias removed a small data crystal from his pocket and placed it on the center of the table. "This is not a list of demands," he said, his voice strong but measured. "This is an invitation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. For too long, this galaxy has been ruled by fear. Empire replaces empire. The strong crush the weak. And eventually, the weak become strong through hatred. And the cycle begins again. His gaze swept across the assembled delegates. "Humanity has walked that path. We know where it leads." He gestured to the crystal. "This is different. A union of worlds, not ruled by any single species, not held together by threats or tribute, but bound by common laws, common rights, and common purpose." The Solarian elder's eyes narrowed. "And if we refuse?" "Then you remain outside the union," Elias said simply. "Free to govern yourselves as you wish, within your own borders, but also alone, without access to the union's protection, its resources, its trade." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was a choice, the one thing that had been stolen from so many for so long. As the delegates whispered among themselves, Lyra leaned close to Elias. "You really think this will work?" she asked quietly. "After everything?" Elias watched the faces around him. Suspicious, calculating, afraid, hopeful. "No," he admitted. "But I think we have to try. Otherwise, what did we fight for?" In the months that followed, the Union of Free Worlds took shape. Not easily. Not without conflict and setbacks. The wounds of centuries couldn't heal overnight. But system by system, world by world, something new emerged from the ashes of the old empires. Not perfect, not utopian, but alive with possibility. Commander Elias Vance did not take a leadership role in the new Union. He declined all offices, all honors. When the celebration ceremonies were held on newly liberated worlds, he was nowhere to be found. Instead, he returned to the Iron Fist. Not as a warship now, but as a vessel of exploration. He gathered a small crew, Lyra, Rook, and a handful of others who couldn't quite adjust to peace, and set course for the edges of known space. "We're not soldiers anymore," he told them as the engines hummed to life. "We're explorers." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "Looking for what?" Elias gazed out at the endless field of stars. "Home." Because one question had haunted him through all the years of fighting, through all the blood and fire. What had happened to Earth, the birthplace of humanity lost in the chaos of the fall? Some said destroyed. Others claimed it was hidden, protected. No one knew for certain. "You think it's still out there?" Rook asked, plotting their course into the unknown. "I think we need to find out," Elias replied. "Not just for ourselves, for what comes next." As the Iron Fist disappeared into the void, leaving behind a galaxy transformed by humanity's return, Commander Elias Vance felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Not the burning satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet spark of hope. Because the forgotten stars weren't just the worlds they had reclaimed or the empires they had toppled. They were the possibilities that lay ahead. The chance to remember not just what they had lost, but what they could become. The journey would be long, the path uncertain. But for the first time, humanity was not running from its past or fighting for vengeance. It was reaching for its future, and the galaxy would remember.